Excellent. First of all, thank you to our hosts, Basel Institute and Europol, for inviting me to speak today. As mentioned, my name is Emma Henshaw. I'm an investigator with TRM Labs. Some of you in the room might use our product. The talk I'm going to give today is around ransomware and then leading into sanctions as a topic. Excellent. So some of the stuff we'll cover in this talk is around ransomware trends, specifically the last few months in ransomware rebranding, so ransomware groups and the ways that they look to rebrand their names after law enforcement action, methods of obfuscation. That is a hard word we should just remove that word from future slides. And then leading into sanctions impact on ransomware groups and the wider sanctions landscape. Oh, it's doing so well with tech. There we go. So we've just kind of closed on August, and the stats for August, there were 63 publicly disclosed attacks for August. Ransomware Hub, some of you in the room might be familiar with. They're one of the most heavily active groups for this period. But we've also seen new variants come to the ground. So Links and Hell Down, recent groups that we've seen being active. For June, it was a kind of quieter month for June in volume of attacks, but there were certainly some notable attacks. On the slide there, we have CDK Global. The Synovus attack, 50 million was the ransomware demand, wasn't paid in that instance, but we can start to see the scale of the demands that are coming in. July, we saw a significant increase in attacks in July compared to the previous year. Government, education, health, these still remain the high targets. Typically, we see the targets in US infrastructure. What was interesting in July is that we saw a surge of attacks in Australia, 7 recorded for the month of July. So certainly something that we're seeing is an increase in the attacks, but we're not necessarily seeing an increase in the payments being paid. Okay, so as I said, ransom demands at an all-time high. I guess the idea is maybe you don't need as many frequency of attacks if you're being 50 million in on one ransom demand. So we're seeing that these payment values are increasing, and the scale of attacks is increasing with that. So in early 24, the average demand is around $5.4 million. But as you can see, everyone was probably familiar with the MGM attack in 23. And that was an $80 million demand. Dark Angels are being particularly active. We'll look at that demand on the next slide, what that looks like on chain. And then one of the largest demands for this period was actually a $100 million ransomware demand of India's regional organised crime unit. So obviously the audacity of these ransomware actors typically don't have a conscience in who they go after and who they target. So as I mentioned, this was the Dark Angels ransomware attack. So the total value was 75 million, paid across 3 separate transactions. And this is a Fortune 50 company paying a record-breaking amount for that year. So how do they evade kind of law enforcement action? So one of the things we see is the activity they do as they're operating and their general behaviour. And then we can also look at, well, what does law enforcement action on these ransomware groups cause these groups to do? What is their next behavior? Okay, so there are a number of groups that have rebranded. A lot of them have kind of spin-off names. This is just a kind of selection of a few of those and probably names familiar with most in the room. So one of the things we can see in how they rebrand is actually their on-chain patterns of transactions. So the example you see on the graph there is Vice Society, sorry, referring to Grand Theft Auto game. So Vice Society, they're sending funds and they're co-spending with a Residia ransomware group. So actually we can see this overlap on chain where maybe they present themselves as separate groups or there's this overlap in their naming. But when we look at them on chain, we start to see the ways that these funds commingle and spend together. Next slide, please. So what are the other ways they might obfuscate? We can think of rebranding as a way to try and confuse tracking or assign activity to one particular group. But we can also look at the ways that they're just moving those funds to try and hide and complicate the tracing methods. And next slide. So there are a number of different methods that they can obviously use. As technology advances as well, that gives them new avenues to move funds. There's a slight shift towards kind of complex technical services that they'll use. We touched on already, like the idea of mixers and to non-custodial exchanges, cross-chain bridges and swaps, just to try and confuse the tracing. And then we also, the question always comes around privacy coins. Typically we see Bitcoin is still kind of king in the world of ransomware. Some ransomware groups will offer a discount if you pay in Monero. One of the questions around Monero always becomes the liquidity. If you're taking a ransom for $100 million, how are you going to move that kind of funds on chain? And I've mentioned gambling services there. They're not as technically advanced a kind of solution, but there has been an increase in ransomware actors utilizing gambling services as a way to launder the funds. So if you have an investigation looking at ransomware and you start to see exposure to gambling services, it could be an indication that that's what this group is doing. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this is an example of clock ransomware group. What we typically have seen, and there's a certain amount of patience that comes with these ransomware groups. If you're dealing with a large amount of funds over a long period of time, you don't necessarily need to be moving those instantly. And what they'll do is collate those funds on the Bitcoin blockchain. For some groups, we saw funds from 2021 being sat in addresses, and then 2023, they were suddenly swept in these large transactions into single addresses. And then once they collate them in those single Bitcoin addresses, we saw them bridge first to the Avalanche blockchain, and then oh, thank you. And then they bridged from the Avalanche blockchain over to Ethereum. And then what we saw when they moved those funds to Ethereum is that it interacted with these Telegram-based bot services, so these asset swap services. And like I say, there was a patience in doing this for Clop in particular. Some of them, Lockbit, not to trigger the NCA in the audience, but Lockbit, they waited 2-3 years to move some of their funds. Next slide. So nice little segue now into the sanctions side of things. Obviously, sanctions are heavily enforced in the world of ransomware, where we typically see them. Next slide. This will probably be a name familiar to most and not surprising, but Garantex still leads in terms of ransomware sanction exposure. So since May 22, it's received at least 12.4 billion euros worth of incoming volume. Other names you'll see on the slides will be Novatex as well, Iranian-based exchange, but by far and away, Garantex has the largest exposure with sanctions activity and ransomware in particular. Next slide. So an example of this for a specific ransomware group, this is Akira ransomware group, and some of the interesting things when we think about exposure, we normally think about it in terms of depositing to Garantex or off-ramp, but we can also look at it in the way that they share exposure. So here we have Akira ransomware moving funds into an address that also has incoming funds from Garantex as well. So we can think about its exposure in a couple of different ways. And we can think about exposure to sanctions at the address level, whether that's impactive, whether you need to look at it more holistically as a kind of cluster wallet group level. Next slide. So this leads us into sanctions overall. There's thought to my madness. This will just quickly cover some of the on-chain and off-chain elements that we've seen to sanctions activity and some familiar kind of methods that we saw previously. So next slide. So as I mentioned, Novatex before, they just dominate this landscape in terms of sanctions activity. And then you have Tornado Cash in there as well. So perhaps a question around, we sanction these entities, and for a while there's a drop off in their volume and activity, and then it starts to just slowly increase again and stays pretty consistent. So like I said, Garantex was 70% volume of all sanctions related activity. Novatex is dominant as well in this space, 3 billion since 2023 in relation to sanctioned entities. And as Ariana mentioned, lots of things end up on Tron. So Tron, like for other illicit activities, tends to be the preferred blockchain for sanctions movement. 78% of sanctions activity on Tron in 2024. Next slide, please. So we talk about sanctioned entities like Garantex, but what is Garantex's link to other on-chain entities? We see global centralized exchanges being one of the largest counterparties to sanctioned entities. This might be a couple of indicators here, either at scale cashing out or just individuals moving funds from the sanctioned entity into a major centralized exchange in order to cash out. And one of the things that will be interesting to monitor in the coming months is the kind of 180 that Russia's had in its approach to cryptocurrency. So now they're talking more about uses of mining and new exchanges being developed in Russia, and whether we'll start to see then either an increase in volume on chain to Garantex or other Russian-based exchanges becoming dominant in that space. And one of the things to think about in terms of traditional sanction activity, and we've touched on, is this is still a massive amount of money. So whilst they're going to potentially use cryptocurrency to move funds, they're still going to be using traditional, property investments, traditional methods of evading sanctions as well, just because of the sheer volume of funds. That's a lot of money to try and move singularly through cryptocurrency. Next slide. So like ransomware, those entities that have been sanctioned also look to use rebranding as a way to evade, or like any celebrity having a PR disaster, changing their name many times. It's the same activity for some of these sanctioned exchanges. So if I could go next slide. So any UK law enforcement in the room will be familiar with this little cyclical graph that I used to steal this example, but when we look at sanctions, we think about this in terms of just this continual cycle process. So law enforcement and blockchain analytics, you're identifying these entities with links to illicit crime, that we collect information about them, we evaluate their scale, we decide to impact sanctions on them, and then this process tends to begin again. Next slide. So one real case example of this is we were monitoring off-chain conversations around a relatively new exchange that had appeared. The individuals were posting kind of customer service complaints that they had in relation to this exchange. So we took a look at its on-chain patterns. And what we do when there's a relatively new exchange on the block is look at its first activity. Where is it getting its liquidity from? If it's Tron, where is its addresses being activated from? And what we saw is that it had links to a sanctioned exchange. So what they had essentially done is rebranded, created their name under a new exchange, but thanks to this off-chain customer insights, and then looking at the on-chain behavior, we're able to determine this rebranding. And then next slide. So like I mentioned, a lot of these sanctions come from OFAC in relation to the ongoing conflict with Russia and Ukraine. And this trend has continued. Clearly a large number of crypto-related designations, and probably we're going to continue to see this behavior. So I want to just go over a couple of techniques that these entities do. So prior to being designated, how do they look to obfuscate their funds? Next slide. So one of the things they'll do, they'll use intermediary wallets to try and confuse the tracking or increase the tracing that you have to do. This is an example of a sanctioned individual related to disinformation campaign. What we noticed on Tron was the use of a lot of intermediate addresses before hitting centralized exchanges, and then also using those exchanges that have little to no KYC checks. Next slide. And then we also see the use of peeling chains as well. So breaking down cryptocurrency into smaller denominations and hoping that at least if you hit an exchange with 20 deposits, enough of them will go through or not flag any potential behavior, and then increasing the distance of exposure to their original sanctioned entity and address.